Matt Bumgarner about something that's unusual, but it's also a part of our history and a very popular part, the Civil War. And Matt, we're here in the section of the museum where we have maybe 3 dozen pictures of Civil War soldiers in their uniforms. That's quite I feel like that's quite an impressive array of pictures that we have.
Absolutely. Caldwell County has a rich and storied history for both the Confederate and the Union standpoint.
That's right. Now that's kind of what we're going to be hitting on in a few minutes. But before we get to the Union standpoint, I'd like to give credit to the Sons of the Confederate Veterans who have done these pictures for us. I understand they have a few more pictures that they're going to bring up sometime, and we'll look forward to getting those too. But you're right, Matt, we do have a good history of Caldwell County. I believe about 5 companies were formed to be a part of the Confederate Services Army, the Confederate States Army. And then we also, our one brush with war here in Caldwell County has been when a fellow named Stoneman came through. And I don't think Stoneman, we have a reputation for being hospitable here in Caldwell County, but I don't think we made Stoneman too welcome.
Well, Stoneman and some of his men called Lenoir a rebellious little hole. Unfortunately, Stoneman came through and Lenoir was occupied at really the worst possible time. It was at the end of the war and during the assassination of Abraham Lincoln.
Right. And I believe that rebellious little hole was a compliment, don't you?
I believe it was.
Okay, but Stoneman was a professional soldier.
Yes.
And he apparently a very knowledgeable military man. Even though he was on the wrong side, he was still a very knowledgeable and apparently a fairly astute soldier.
Everything that I've ever read about him, character-wise, speaks very highly of him. Unfortunately, some of the same things can't be said about some of his officers that were underneath him.
And I've got a feeling you're referring to the person we're going to be talking the most about today, and that's well, maybe I'm a little loose saying gentleman, but a man named Kirk, is that right?
That's correct.
Well, let's sit down here and talk about Kirk just a little bit.
Okay.
Matt, I'm fortunate in that when I need to know something about Civil War history, there are several people here in the county and in the area that I can call on about different aspects of it. When I want to know something about Kirk, you're the fellow, because you've even done a book about it called Kirk's Raiders. I believe the book is, about 5 years old now?
I believe that's right.
The subtitle is A Notorious Band of Scoundrels and Thieves, and that's not a very complimentary title. But let's talk about him just a little bit. Who was Kirk?
Well, on the subtitle, the Kirk family wasn't very pleased with that subtitle. I must say that. However, that's a direct quote from some of the official reports. George Kirk was one of 5 sons who hailed from East Tennessee. To understand George Kirk, you have to understand Western North Carolina and East Tennessee during the Civil War. Now, I must admit, prior to researching this book, all I really knew about the Civil War was what I'd been taught in school, which I must say is to the victor belong the spoils.
Right.
And what we learned about the Civil War in the South, particularly Western North Carolina, what I uncovered really blew me away. I was stunned. Depending on who you talk to, when anything was ratified and when it was actually approved, North Carolina and Tennessee were the 11th and 12th states in the Confederacy. North Carolina did not want to join the Confederacy initially, and of course neither did Tennessee, and mainly because the mountainous regions of East Tennessee and Western North Carolina were very much against secession from the Union. These were first, second, third generation Scotch-Irish immigrants. The plantation economies that you may have found around the Mississippi River, around the Cape Fear River, in eastern North Carolina, western Tennessee, were completely irrelevant to the mountain folks, basically west of the Catawba River. You did have some large plantations in Caldwell County and Burke County, but nothing like on the scale
Right.
of the North Carolina coast. These people were just completely opposed to the plantation economy because it meant nothing to them. By and large, they were not slaveholders. By and large, they came from another country where they were oppressed, and the United States gave them the freedoms that they lacked. So they were not really opposed to withdrawing from the Union. Furthermore, the technology at the time that was really evolving was railroads. In North Carolina, the plan was to build from west to east and have all the productions of the mountains and the Piedmonts go out the North Carolina ports. They didn't want it going to Charleston. They didn't want it going to Norfolk. It was argued that western North Carolina needed a railroad worse. However, eastern North Carolina got it first. So you had a lot of political animosity. So it was in this environment, in this background, that George Kirk was raised.
Matt, if I may stop you for just a minute, I want to go back, and I think the slip of the tongue there a few minutes ago. You said they were not opposed. They were opposed to secession.
I'm sorry, they were opposed to secession.
Okay.
Yes, yes.
All right, I'm sorry. Yeah.
So what you have to look at is western North Carolina, East Tennessee, a large percentage of the population does not want to withdraw from the Union. Now, of course, in the initial stages of the war, what can you do? They're an island among themselves. It is not until 1863 when General Burnside actually comes out of the border state of Kentucky and occupies East Tennessee that this Union support is able to be tapped.
Right.
Then they can start getting the guns and the support from basically Knoxville into the mountains. Really, what the lightning rod incident, a lot of the viewers I'm sure are familiar with Cold Mountain and the way the Home Guard is portrayed. Right. What you have to understand about this conflict is there were atrocities committed on both sides.
Absolutely.
And in many cases, the Home Guard was as ruthless as portrayed in the movie. In many cases, they were not. However, in the particular case that I'm about to refer to was called the Shelton Laurel Massacre. What happened, George Kirk had 5 brothers. One of his brothers was on a scouting mission and helped organize this band. They were called Tories, or Home Yankees. They weren't real Yankees, but they were called Home Yankees. Right. So in Madison County towards Hot Springs, it was called Warm Springs at the time, about 20 miles northwest of Asheville. Salt was in very short supply in 1863, and these Tories raided the salt storage rooms in Marshall, and they also raided the house of the Home Guard General Lawrence Allen. Unfortunately, he had 2 children ill at the time in bed at home with scarlet fever. They died after the raid. Of course, the raiders were blamed for that. As a result, the Home Guard came down very heavy on people that were perceived to be Tories or Home Yankees and those supposed to be involved in the raid. These people were killed, some of them under the age of 15. Even Governor Vance was outraged that his own troops did this and called for the arrest of those involved. But needless to say, this is what really started the animosity, the bushwhackers, the atrocities that one side would commit upon the other. And it was in this firestorm where George Kirk began his rise to prominence.
Okay, had George Kirk been a part of the Union Army prior to this, or is this his first connection with the Army?
His brothers were in the various Tennessee units. He joined in and then was assigned to the 2nd North Carolina Mounted Infantry. The 2nd North Carolina Mounted Infantry was formed with all Yankee officers from Pennsylvania, Illinois, Ohio. He was promoted from a Tennessee regiment into the captain of Company A of the 2nd North Carolina Mounted Infantry. his task was to go and round up deserters from the Confederate Army and local supporters, local Tories. That's when he really rose to prominence with the 2nd North Carolina. The 2nd North Carolina, however, had some serious problems with its Yankee leadership. They really and truly looked down their noses at the Southern troops and the Southern men. The 2nd North Carolina Mounted Infantry was called mounted because they were all supposed to have horses. Well, several months after being organized, there were only 30 horses for 600 men. Most of them were poorly armed. At that point, Kirk started agitating to have his own command.
Right. Okay, could we digress just a moment? You mentioned several brothers, 5 brothers.
There were 5 brothers.
Okay, and they did they all have careers similar to George Kirk?
They did. Some of them with Tennessee units. Some of them he had one teenage brother who became a captain under Kirk himself, who was almost mortally wounded. He was severely wounded. However, none rose to the prominence of George.
Right. You do give a little bit of family information in the book, and I think they did not prosper too well even after the war, but maybe that's a story for another time.
Right, right.
But okay. Did Kirk, what is his influence on us here in Caldwell County?
Well, what happened, Kirk rose through the ranks and ultimately became colonel of the 2nd North Carolina Mounted Infantry and the 3rd North Carolina Mounted Infantry. Initially, they were basically just roving bands in the mountains of East Tennessee, western North Carolina. As the noose started tightening, as Stoneman kept getting closer, as Lee was pushed further back, Kirk was assigned to be the rear guard of Stoneman's push through the North Carolina mountains. Now, prior to 1999, my experience with Stoneman was basically driving to Boone and seeing George Stoneman pass through here. Wow, okay, that's fairly close, but he passed through, big deal. What happened was, when Stoneman came through, he was here only a matter of days. Kirk was actually the occupying force in Boone and in Lenoir for a week to 10 days. You mentioned some of the character issues earlier, how Stoneman was a professional soldier, and we kind of alluded that those under him were not. That's best said by a widow who her farm was occupied. She found Stoneman to be a perfect gentleman. She was free to come and go all she wanted. When Kirk came, after Stoneman left and he occupied the town, she was made a prisoner in her own room. She was treated very poorly. And when his soldiers left, she said all that was left were a few pieces of rotten meat and some chicken feathers. That was all that was left of her farm. Now, as of Lenoir was concerned, Kirk basically stayed most of his time on top of the mountain in Boone. However, he sent his men down. He was trying to find Colonel A.C. Avery, who commanded a very strong home guard here. Or over in Morganton, but he would raid back and forth and actually put up quite a stand, or his troops did, at the Catawba River. But Kirk came down and his men actually occupied the hill that we're on now. And they said that they brought their horses into the lower floors of Davenport College. His men the prisoners were held at the Episcopal Church. So, and again, you can't underestimate, this is the worst possible time of the war. Lenoir, western North Carolina, in fact, hadn't suffered, but here we are, the last days of the war. The president, who was the hero, the quarterback of the Union team, had been assassinated. So you can imagine the ill will that there were here, that was felt among
And Lee had already surrendered.
Lee had actually surrendered. Now, actually, over in eastern Carolina, around Durham, you still had Johnston fighting Sherman, but still, that was only a matter of days.
Right.
men left here very quickly, but they left an indelible mark, certainly upon the
Right.
population.
They did, right.
In another way, Kirk affected the area because I'm sure anybody vaguely familiar with Lenoir's history has heard of G.W.F. Harper. Kirk's greatest accomplishment was raiding Camp Vance in Morganton at the end of June 1864. Basically, he came out of the mountains out of nowhere. The camp at the time had just received some new conscripts, no training, no arms. He came out of the woods, said, okay, surrender. They effected surrender. He disappeared into the mountains. Home guard, regular troops were dispatched from Salisbury, could not find him. It was actually George Harper, who happened to be home during the raid here in Lenoir, went out towards the burnt Caldwell line in the vicinity of Brown Mountain, a place called Piedmont Springs, and actually stumbled across them as they were headed up towards the winding stairs where Highway 18 or 181 starts climbing up towards Pinola. And it was Harper who first found them. And he had his horse shot out from underneath him and had to stay at the Perkins farm overnight. But he actually captured some supplies and things like that. And Kirk may have completely disappeared if not for Harper. The next day, the men were able to put some sort of skirmish together from Salisbury, but Kirk had the advantage of the mountains, and they just couldn't stop him.
Right. You mentioned A.C. Avery a few minutes ago. That's an interesting story about him being disguised by his own men, I believe, and that supposedly happened while he was being held prisoner here at the Episcopal Church in Lenoir.
It did happen here. He was in Salisbury the morning that Stoneman came through and was captured, just in general. And other people recognized him, was able to get him a change of clothes, and there was a forced march basically from Salisbury
Right.
to Statesville to Taylorsville to here. And he was able to be disguised, and they all kept him, away from prying eyes, despite Kirk was saying he wanted to kill the damned fool, and just made all kinds of threats, and people just held their ground. And he lived many, many years after the war.
There is an interesting story about one of the Sherrill men, I believe was his last name, who had been taken prisoner, and he took it upon, he recognized Avery and knew that of his disguise, and took it on himself to stay as close to Avery as he could. And theoretically, a man named Keith Blaylock, whom I'm sure we'll get to a little bit later, occupied, the three of them slept under the same blanket one night, and Keith had avowed that he would kill Avery if he ever got close enough to him. And I don't know whether that's a true story that they slept under the same blanket, but obviously he did come in contact with him.
Right.
Because at that time, Blaylock was supporting Stoneman's men as they were with their prisoners.
Right. I don't know about the blanket story either, and a big thing you have to know is, certainly in Blaylock's case, the stories grew bigger
Right.
as the years went on. However, there's really no doubt in my mind. There's too many tales from too many people that A.C. Avery was indeed protected by his fellow prisoners,
Right.
and he certainly would have been strung up. There's just no doubt in my mind about that.
Yeah, Louisa Norwood, in the letter that she wrote about Stoneman's raid in Lenoir, mentions seeing Cousin Avery being held prisoner. That her family walked the area that's now Norwood Street over to the Episcopal Church, I guess, to see the prisoners, and that she saw her cousin Avery there. But of course, she kept her mouth shut about it too. And I don't imagine anyone recognized him officially that particular day.
Right.
Not anyone who could do him any harm anyway.
Right.
Matt, we have mentioned the book before, but one of the most interesting things to me is in the back of the book you have the roster of the 2nd North Carolina Mounted Infantry and the 3rd North Carolina Mounted Infantry. And if you look at those names, a lot of those names were native to Caldwell County, and some of the same names still show up in Caldwell County today. Do you suppose we'd be offending anyone if we talked about who some of these people were?
I don't think so. Kirk himself, as a character, left a lot to be desired. But some of his troops, of course, were honorable. I mean, it's like anything. You
Right.
have your good ones and your bad ones, and
I'm sure some were very sincere in what they were doing.
absolutely. Well, if your family is starving, the end is inevitably
Right.
near. To pass up a horse, $60 in gold and a new rifle would be very hard to pass up. I mean, at some point, what you're fighting for breaks down, and you're going on a much more basic level. So it's hard to fault some of the guys.
And I think it's probably pretty much a fact of Civil War history that a lot of people realized the end was here before it actually happened at Washington Courthouse.
Absolutely.
That maybe as much as 6 months to a year before some realized it was a lost cause. And which I agree that probably it took it to a more basic level than that too. But there were also people not only from Caldwell, but Wilkes and Watauga.
Oh, absolutely.
The whole area, actually.
The further west you get, the more people you have. It's amazing. Boone was actually, Caldwell and Burke were kind of the border counties, if you will. That's when you start seeing significant numbers, which makes sense. After you go further west from Caldwell and Burke, you really start losing the plantations.
Right.
But in Boone, well, if everybody knows where the Green Park Inn is, that was actually Kirk's fort. It was called Fort Rollins, in honor of one of his majors from Madison County. But if you look at the rosters, the amount of men from particularly Watauga and Wilkes County is unbelievable. And if you look at how many of those people deserted, they signed up in the last 6 weeks of the war and deserted 6 weeks later. It's phenomenal. And if you look where they were deserted, Boone, and they were from Wilkesboro, or they were from Morganton. They signed up, got their benefit, got their pension, and should have all their lives, and just got out of Dodge after that. So
there might have been a method to their madness.
absolutely, absolutely.
Perhaps, but the book brings out something too that the end of the war didn't put an end to Kirk nor his marauding either, and perhaps
I think George Kirk would have been less of a footnote in history if it weren't for Reconstruction. Now, a lot of people, well, first of all, I'll tell you this book. I've been accused of being too soft on Kirk, and I've been accused of being too hard on Kirk.
what do you think?
There were atrocities on both sides. And
There usually are.
And I want to tell the story from both sides. But I've been called a neo-Confederate, and I've been called just a bleeding heart Union supporter. I'm neither. History is history. It is what it is. Kirk would have been a footnote to history, or if it weren't for Reconstruction, which truly, to me, were not in terms of human life, but in terms of how the South was treated, how stereotypes of the South exist to this day. This is the dark era when all this was born. Basically, what happened was the southern states each were divided into military districts. Provisional governors were appointed. A newspaper editor, William Woods Holden, was appointed governor of North Carolina by President Grant.
He was a Unionist himself.
At the end of the war he was a fire-eating secessionist to begin with.
Oh, okay.
He was a leopard who changed his spots.
Okay.
Then as now, people appreciated loyalty. And he was a turncoat. It may have been a good business decision, but it didn't necessarily endear him to anyone. One of the things that Holden did was basically remove anybody who had anything to do with the Confederacy from any public office, any public-owned corporation like the North Carolina Railroad, the Western North Carolina Railroad. And in its place, he appointed, and it sounds like a cliche, carpetbaggers and scalawags. Carpetbaggers were folks who came from the north and took advantage of a lot of people. Scalawags were basically native Southerners who turned their loyalties towards the north. It's a simple fact, that's what he did. He went too far, and he swung the pendulum too far left. That resulted in the rise of a movement which is collectively known as the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan, which of course is an evil entity today, had a different connotation early on, before they started the tar and the feathering and the whipping. It was an organization of ex-Confederates trying to protect their rights. That group obviously swung the pendulum way too far the other way.
Right.
Again, atrocities on both sides. Central North Carolina, particularly Orange County, Alamance County, and Caswell County, were declared to be in a state of insurrection. A state senator was even murdered by the Ku Klux Klan in the middle of a town meeting. They lured him into the basement of the Yanceyville courthouse and strangled him. William Holden sought support from Grant. President Grant said, "Raise your own troops." Holden said, "I picked George Kirk to lead the troops, specifically because his name is a terror to the people of North Carolina." Kirk raised his old regiments. Most of them didn't fight. Most of the people for the 2nd and 3rd at that time said, we're going with our lives. So fresh recruits were brought in from East Tennessee, Western North Carolina. They went to Burlington. They went to Yanceyville, occupied the town. They arrested nearly 200 people, held them. The Supreme Court of North Carolina issued writs of habeas corpus. You cannot arrest these people without cause. What are the charges? Kirk said, "I'm holding them under orders of the governor. I dare you to raise an army and come face me." This is daring the Chief Justice of the state to come do this. Kirk gave a speech from the Yanceyville courthouse to the townspeople and said, "If anybody even takes a shot at one of my men, I will kill the women and children of this town." This is a government officer leading this.
And this is after the Civil War.
This is during Reconstruction, several years after the war. Interestingly enough, from the same speech, a copy of it was found written in William Holden's handwriting. Holden wrote this speech for Kirk. And it was this, amongst other charges related to Reconstruction, that led to the impeachment of William Woods Holden. Kirk he saw that the tide was turning. He acted so poorly against the people of Central Carolina, even President Grant withdrew his support. Kirk had to release his prisoners ultimately after a several month struggle. He was arrested. The Republican sheriff of Wake County let him out of jail one night, and he slipped through the woods and caught a train home back to Tennessee. Holden was actually impeached. He was the first governor who was actually impeached and convicted in the history of the United States.
Okay, you've been talking about the central and eastern part of the state a little bit, but in the mountains of North Carolina, there was still a lot of bushwhackers, a lot of marauding going on too. Is that a part of Kirk? Or?
Well, yes, absolutely. After the war, the thing which you have to understand with Kirk created such an aura about him that any little incident that may have happened from the Catawba River west, it must have been Kirk. Mothers used to tell their babies, "You better be good, or Captain Kirk is be coming for you tonight."
Oh my goodness.
So it was a true terror. He was called a bushwhacker, but he was a regular federal officer. When they attacked Camp Vance, they were in their regular uniforms. However, Of course, if they're going through the woods, stealing horses, trying to set fire to inflict some sort of sabotage, a lot of times they were dressed as a normal farmer would. You wouldn't want to be dressed in a blue coat, and you might as well paint a bullseye on yourself. But there were a lot of bushwhacking incidents, especially after the war. Sherman had it. We've always heard of all the aftermath of Sherman's march to the sea in Atlanta. The same way here, when Stoneman pulled out, Kirk came in, and Kirk left. Even here in Caldwell County, you had an incident known as Fort Hamby, right towards the Watauga, the Wilkes-Caldwell border, where there was a group of local outlaws who hooked up with some unknowns, basically. And it is widely believed they were some of Kirk's men. And finally, you had men from Caldwell, Alexander, and Wilkes converge, and there was a bloody battle. And to this day, nobody knows who half the people inside the log house were that were killed.
Yeah, I have read several different things about Fort Hamby, and every time I read something, it raises more questions than it settles with me. I cannot get a picture of what Fort Hamby was and what actually went on there, or why it went on.
That is the biggest mystery that I would like to see solved. It was a well-fortified cabin, and it was just a bunch of thieves, and the locals got tired of being harassed, best I can tell. But I'd like to know who these men were. I mean, the identities of some, including the leaders, have been identified, but some of the armed men, the cutthroats who were with them, no earthly idea.
And I suppose the farther we get from it, the less likely we are to be able to solve the mystery too. Getting back to the mountains of North Carolina, here in the mountainous section of Caldwell County, up in the Globe area, we had a lot of, or some of this going on, it seems. And we mentioned a while ago a man named Keith Blaylock, and I suppose maybe a lot of people know who he is if I can take the liberty of telling you just a little bit about him. He was conscripted, I believe, into the Confederate Army, but he was really a Union sympathizer all along. His wife, Melinda, went along with him. She cut her hair and put on men's clothing and was actually his tent mate for a while. And I don't think they served very long, maybe a month or a little longer. And I think their intent was to, if they could get into battle, then that he would desert and go to the Union Army. However, the time he went in, seems to be a little bit of a lull, and he was not getting involved in battles. So he rolled in poison ivy, I believe, and got a rash that the doctors didn't know what to do with, so he got a medical discharge. And I believe Melinda also let her identity be known and was discharged also. But she is in the records as Sam Blaylock, as Keith's brother, I believe. She identified herself as his brother. But then after he comes back to the mountains, I believe he actually lived on Grandfather Mountain, maybe.
Yes.
And then he gets involved with this group of marauders, and maybe that's where you need to pick up the story again.
Well, again, this was one of the bigger surprises for me. I really didn't realize the amount of Union support that were in the mountains. You actually had several people. You had there was one family by the name of Hartleys, not to be confused with the Hartleys from Caldwell County. But in Blowing Rock, you had that family, and then you had the Blaylocks. The Blaylocks were associated with George Kirk, as were different other Tory groups. Some, the South Mountains had some. The Yadkin River Valley had some. But the Blaylocks, along with just the personality, a lot of people called him Keith Blaylock as well as a nickname.
Right.
But him and Melinda, they're the force of the personalities and just the gall of actually a woman signing up to fight and then revealing herself to Zeb Vance of all people to try to get out of the Army. That really built their legend. But yes, they were the terror of the Globe Valley. They would raid any Confederate sympathizer. If a man and woman farmer had a son serving in the Army, they would raid the farm. There's one particular farm that they raided several times, and Keeson lost his eye. They were repelled, they attacked, were repelled, attacked, were repelled. But they were really little more than horse thieves, and a very good conduit for people. Salisbury had the large prison, and escapes were regular. Well, Salisbury really isn't that far away, relatively speaking. And people would, sure enough, head west, head northwest, head for the mountains. Well, more than likely, you're going to have to go through Caldwell County. So once you make it to the Globe, the Blaylocks were a very effective conduit running people on over the mountain.
I believe the farm that they attacked so many times was one of the Moores, wasn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
And of course, that's a very prominent family in the Globe, or was in those days, and I suppose there's still some of their descendants living in that area. I know there's plenty of them in Caldwell County still. And Melinda, though, rode with him even on his marauding expeditions too, it seems.
Absolutely. Some of the accounts in the book of the attacks on the Moore farm, she was involved in, certainly in both the attacks where they were ultimately repelled. The Moore family held their honor very well. Now, their son, who was in the Army that they were being attacked for, happened to be home during one of the attacks, and they didn't expect that. Right. And he directed a very successful defense of the family farm. And
I think one of the things that is told is that Keith resented, or was trying to get even, I guess would be a better way of saying it, that the man who had shot his stepfather, Austin Coffey, and that he, that was one of the reasons that he was so upset with some of the people in the Globe, because they felt like that they had supported the shooting of his stepfather, who was a Union sympathizer also.
Right.
You mentioned the Hartleys a few minutes ago and stated that I guess you were referring to the Watauga County branch of the Hartleys. Now, some of their descendants have gotten into Caldwell County too. And I may surprise them. They're related to me just a little bit because their mother was a Green and my mother was a Green. And so that ties them in with me just a little bit, I'm afraid. So. That probably is going. They probably all turn their televisions off now. They won't listen to anything else we're saying, Matt. But you're right about the legend of Keith and Melinda, and it has been the subject of several books. One called Rebels in Blue, one called a novel that Dale Wilson wrote called The Grandfather in the Globe. Sharon McCrum has written one called Ghost Riders. It's also a novel, and of course with novels there's going to be a little bit of liberty taken.
Right.
But they're all interesting reading, and I think anyone is interested in those legends, and I think those are good things to read.
They are. They're very good tales. They are historical fiction, though. There are
right.
There are some things that you just have to take with a grain of salt.
Right.
But it makes for great reading.
Right. Well, as with all fiction,
right.
all historical fiction, there's going to have to be some liberties taken. I've been surprised, or been reminded, I guess I should say here, since we've been talking, when you talked about the general scope of the Civil War, how much I know about the Civil War from Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind, which I guess is the granddaddy of all the Civil War novels, particularly. But it does reflect a lot of the Southern thought and the Southern sympathizing, and a lot of the Southern way of life, which I think is basically the background for a soap opera story.
Certainly.
But it does give us a great look into that period of history.
Right.
Matt, I understand that Keith Blaylock ran for a state office, I believe state senate, but was defeated. I don't know whether that says something about the way people looked at elected officials in that day and time as compared to the way we look at them today or not. But I'm not sure what happened to Kirk after the war. Did he live a rich and happy life, or what happened?
Well, the Kirk family, for the most part, the brothers moved to Illinois and bought a huge farm, which says probably a lot about their spoils of war, because they were a very poor family prior to the war. A lot of the relatives stayed in Illinois and are there to this day. Kirk followed George Stoneman to California. He's said to have made and lost several fortunes speculating in gold mining. Ultimately, he died a penniless man. He lost his sanity, was said to sleep with his sword in case the devil was to come get him in the middle of the night. And he is buried in a small town around San Francisco. And his tombstone just reads 3rd Mounted Infantry, 3rd North Carolina Mounted Infantry. It doesn't mention that he was a captain or a colonel.
Okay. I believe Keith Blaylock died sometime after the turn of the century, sometime in the early 1900s, on a railroad car, I believe, wasn't it?
As I understand, he was on a hand car and overturned on the Clinchfield Railroad.
I believe that his wife, I think, had passed away a few years previously. But I think he probably had some age on him. He'd got to be a relatively old man by that time anyway. And so he lived actually a long life, I think.
For those that enjoy going to the library, some of the older newspapers where W.W. Scott was the editor of the paper, periodically Blaylock would write the editor, and they would exchange barbs back and forth. They're quite humorous. I believe that the book on sale here, the Annals of Caldwell County, have printed some of those barbs. They're funny reading.
Yes, thanks to W.W. Scott, we know a great deal about Caldwell County history that we might not know otherwise. And this might be a good time, too, to mention, we have here at the Caldwell Heritage Museum a reading room, and we have a lot of military books, including a lot of Civil War books. Now, we're not limited to the Civil War, but anyone who wants to find out any military history, I would suggest that they come here and use our reading room. I think they might find some things that would be quite interesting to them. And Matt, I'm going to ask you a question. This may be chasing a rabbit just a little bit, but I want to, it's a question for my own edification, I guess, more than anything else. I know you identify yourself always as a railroad historian. You've done a great deal to preserve the railroad's history. How in the world does a railroad historian write a book about Kirk's Raiders?
I was invited by the Sons of Confederate Veterans Camp in Burke County to come give a talk on the Western North Carolina Railroad. At the outbreak of the Civil War, the railroad ended in Morganton. I, of course, told about this raid that Kirk, I mentioned this man, Kirk. I knew very little about Kirk, and I mentioned that name, and they spit and cursed and swore like the man came through yesterday. And I thought, wow, this is interesting. And it just so happened I was in a Rowan County library doing some research, and I ran across some stuff about Kirk and the raid. Wow, I didn't hear this. So I called some of the members of the camp, and I read them, and they said, wow, we've never heard any of this. Where'd you get it? And I told them, and there's more. So I thought, well, maybe we can have a little sidebar. I would love to do more with the Civil War. I'm a big railroad fan, but the Civil War, most of my great-great-grandfathers fought for various Catawba County and Alexander County regiments. And I said, okay, we'll have a little 50-page book here on Kirk. And the story kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the war ended, and I thought, fabulous, finally, I'm finished. And then Reconstruction hit, and doggone it if I don't have to go again and again. And the story just kept growing. And it is a great story in the history of North Carolina.
And the narrative itself is over 100 pages.
Yes.
Not to mention the addendums at the back that gives a lot of extra information too. Good.
Yes.
Well, that's an interesting story that you're telling there. And I might mention too that Matt has also published a book called My Face to the Enemy, which is a Civil War book about Mr. Tate.
Yes, Samuel McDowell Tate of neighboring Burke County. The Tate family has a long and storied history in Western North Carolina. A lot of people, if you look at the surrounding counties and the men who really led the way to development, Caldwell County, of course, had G.W.F. Harper. The counterpart would be Samuel McDowell Tate in Burke County. He was the one responsible for the railroad to Asheville. He's the one responsible for, at the time it was called the Western North Carolina Insane Asylum, but it's called Broughton Hospital today, but at the time it was a huge medical breakthrough. You have Romulus Linney in Alexander County next door. And the Tates were, well, they were pack rats. They never threw anything away. And when the house was remodeled, a lot of material was found, and there's just some marvelous material. If you're interested in Western North Carolina history, this is first-person account of the 6th North Carolina State Troops. It's just some amazing stuff.
Matt, you've given us a great deal of information today, particularly about a man that we don't know a whole lot about probably, and you've also included the names of some people that many of us have heard about, and we really appreciate your being here with us today. I might mention too, again, that Matt's books are on sale here at the Caldwell Heritage Museum, the ones that we've mentioned, as well as a couple of railroad histories as well. And we'll be glad to sell those to anyone who is interested in buying, and I'm sure Matt would like for me to sell as many as I possibly can. We're coming to you today from the Caldwell Heritage Museum. We're located at 112 Vaden Street in Lenoir, behind the Davenport A+ School. Our hours of operation are 10 till 3 o'clock during the month of February, and we're going to be expanding our hours as spring comes along to 4:30 in the afternoon. That's 10 till 4:30 on Tuesday through Friday, 10 till 3 on Saturday. There's no admission charge, but we do accept donations from people who want to come by if you're so inclined to give us one. And we hope you will come by to see us here at the Caldwell Heritage Museum.
Please support our Caldwell Heritage Museum, 112 Vaden Street, Lenoir, North Carolina, and please visit and support Lenoir and Caldwell County History on Facebook. Thank you.